Lonely Cowboy shared his meal with a weeping widow that night. Her tribe surrounded his fire, the solitary rider. The Dakota winds carried the scent of sage and distant rain. As Jebediah Cole guided his mare through the endless grasslands, October 1874 had painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust, and the setting sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills. At 34 years old, Jeb had spent more nights under the stars than under any roof, and the solitude had become both his companion and his curse. His weathered hands gripped the reins as he scanned the horizon for a suitable camping spot. The mare, a sturdy paint horse named Belle, snorted softly as if sensing his thoughts. They'd been riding together for 3 years now, ever since Jeb left Montana after everything fell apart. "Easy, girl," he murmured, patting her neck. "We'll find water soon." The truth was, Jeb had grown accustomed to talking more to his horse than to people. The last town he'd passed through was for days behind him, and he'd barely spoken 10 words to anyone there. Just enough to buy supplies, a sack of rice, some dried beans, cornmeal, and ammunition. The essentials for a man who preferred the company of coyotes and stars to that of his fellow humans. As the sun dipped lower, he spotted a small grove of cottonwood trees near what looked like a creek bed. Perfect. He guided Belle toward it, his body automatically adjusting to her gait after countless miles together. The creek turned out to have a trickle of water enough for him and Belle, which was all that mattered. Jeb dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it thousands of times. His joints protested slightly. Sleeping on the hard ground for years had taken its toll, but he ignored the discomfort. He unsaddled Belle, brushed her down, and let her drink before hobbling her near the best grass he could find. The routine of making camp was almost meditative. Gather dry wood, range the stones for a fire pit, unroll his bedroll on the flattest ground he could find. His movements were economical, efficient, no wasted energy. That's how you survived out here, by not spending what you couldn't afford to lose. As darkness fell, his small fire crackled to life. Jeb filled his battered pot with water from the creek and set it to boil. Rice again tonight, maybe with a bit of the salt pork if he was feeling generous with himself. He'd learned to make a little go a long way. His stomach had long since stopped complaining about the monotony. He leaned back against his saddle, watching the flames dance. This was his favorite time of day, when the vast emptiness of the prairie didn't feel quite so overwhelming. The fire created a small circle of warmth and light, a temporary home in the wilderness. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Belle's ears twitched, but she continued grazing peacefully. She'd gotten used to the sounds of the night, just like Jeb had. Another howl answered the first, then another. A whole pack. Probably they wouldn't bother him. Coyotes were smart enough to avoid humans unless desperate. Jeb pulled out his last piece of cornbread, wrapped in a cloth to keep it from going completely stale. He'd baked it himself 3 days ago at his last camp, using the Dutch oven he carried despite its weight. A man needed some comforts, after all. He was about to take a bite when he noticed Belle's sudden alertness. The mare's head was up, ears forward, nostrils flaring. She wasn't scared. Jeb knew her scared signals, but she was definitely aware of something he hadn't noticed yet. He set the cornbread down slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the cold point for 5 on his hip. Then he saw her. A figure stood just beyond the ring of firelight, barely visible among the cottonwood trunks. How long had she been there? Jeb's heart raced. He prided himself on his awareness, and someone had gotten this close without him noticing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The figure stepped forward slightly, just enough for the firelight to catch her features. It was a woman, a native woman, from the look of her doeskin dress and the style of her hair. But something was wrong. Her clothes were covered in dust and what looked like dried mud. Her face was streaked with tears, and her eyes held a grief so deep it made Jeb's chest tighten. She didn't answer his question. She didn't move closer or back away. She just stood there, swaying slightly, staring at his fire with those hollow, devastated eyes. Jeb had encountered native peoples before in his travels. Sometimes the meetings were tense, sometimes friendly, always cautious on both sides. But he'd never seen anyone native or white who looked so utterly lost. "Ma'am," he tried again. Softer this time. "You all right?" Still no response. She took another small step forward, and Jeb could see her more clearly. She was perhaps in her mid-20s, though grief had a way of aging people. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and he noticed they were trembling. Not from cold, the evening was mild, but from something deeper. Belle had gone back to grazing, which told Jeb this woman posed no threat. Animals had good instincts about such things. He studied her for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything. Moving slowly, telegraphing his intentions, Jeb picked up his piece of cornbread. He tore it carefully in half, the sound seeming loud in the quiet night. Then he stood up again, slowly, and took a few steps toward her. "Hungry?" he asked, extending half the cornbread toward her. She looked at the offered food, then at his face. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not quite hope, but maybe recognition that here was another human being. Acknowledging her existence, she reached out with shaking fingers and took the cornbread. The first bite seemed to break something inside her. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks as she ate, each bite accompanied by quiet sobs that spoke of a grief too large for words. Jeb stepped back, giving her space, and sat down again by his fire. He ate his half of the cornbread in silence, pretending not to watch as she finished hers. When she was done, something strange happened. She knelt down and placed her palm flat against the earth. Her lips moved, and though Jeb couldn't understand the language, he heard her whisper a name, Dakota. Then, as silently as she'd appeared, she turned and walked back into the darkness beyond the cottonwoods. Jeb sat there for a long time, staring at the spot where she'd vanished, wondering if he'd dreamed the whole encounter. But the missing half of his cornbread was real enough. So was the feeling that something significant had just occurred, something he didn't yet understand. He fed the fire a few more sticks and settled in for the night, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound made him alert. Was she still out there? Was she safe? Who was Dakota? And what had driven her to such depths of sorrow? The prairie had taught Jeb many things over the years, but tonight it had shown him something new. Sometimes the simplest act of sharing could echo in ways you'd never expect. As the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, Jebediah Cole kept watch, unaware that his small gesture of kindness had already set larger forces in motion. The first hour passed with only the familiar sounds of the prairie night. Jeb had given up on sleep, instead sitting with his back against his saddle, the Winchester across his lap. Not that he expected trouble, his instincts told him the woman meant no harm. But years of solitary survival had taught him that vigilance was the price of staying alive. Belle dozed standing up, occasionally shifting her weight from one hip to the other. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and Jeb was considering whether to add more wood when he heard it, the softest whisper of movement in the grass. His hand tightened on the rifle, but he didn't raise it. The sound was wrong for an animal, too deliberate, too careful. Human, then. More than one, from the barely perceptible variations in the rhythm of movement. They came from three directions. Jeb could sense them more than see them, shadows moving among shadows. His military training from a lifetime ago kicked in, mapping positions, calculating angles. But something held him still. Maybe it was Belle's continued calm, or maybe it was the memory of the grieving woman's face. "I know you're there," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the still air. "I mean no harm to anyone." The movement stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, they emerged from the darkness. Native warriors, 7 of them, appearing like ghosts from the prairie grass. They carried bows and lances, but none were drawn or pointed at him. Their faces were painted with symbols Jeb didn't recognize, and their expressions were unreadable in the dim light. One of them, older than the others, with gray streaking his long hair, stepped forward. He studied Jeb with eyes that missed nothing, the rifle across his lap that hadn't been raised, the remnants of the simple meal, the way Jeb sat still and unthreatening despite being surrounded. "You are the one who fed she who grieves," the older man said in accented but clear English. It wasn't a question. Jeb nodded slowly. She looked hungry and sad. "You gave her half of your food when you have little." Again, not a question. These people had been watching, probably since before the woman appeared. The realization should have unsettled Jeb, but somehow it didn't. There was something almost ceremonial about their approach, as if they were fulfilling some obligation. "Seemed like the right thing to do," Jeb replied. The older man said something in his own language to the others. One of them, a younger warrior with a scar across his cheek, responded sharply, gesturing toward Jeb. An argument seemed to be developing, but the older man silenced it with a raised hand. "I am Fights with Wisdom," he said, turning back to Jeb. "The woman you fed is my daughter. Her name is Morning Dove. 3 days ago, she lost her husband, Dakota, and her young son to the spotted sickness, the same sickness that has taken many of our people. Smallpox." Jeb had seen its devastation in other native communities. The disease swept through like wildfire, leaving grief and empty lodges in its wake. "I'm sorry for her loss," Jeb said, meaning it. Fights with Wisdom studied him for another long moment. "You are alone on the prairie. No companions, little food. Yet you shared. This is unexpected from a white man." Jeb almost smiled at that. "I haven't found much kindness from white men either, truth be told." Something shifted in the older man's expression. He spoke again to his companions, and this time there seemed to be agreement. 2 of the younger warriors disappeared back into the darkness. "My daughter has been wandering for 2 days, lost in her grief. We have been searching. She was drawn to your fire, and you showed her kindness when you had no reason to. This creates—" He paused, searching for the right word. "An obligation." "No obligation," Jeb said quickly. "I didn't do it expecting anything. That is why the obligation exists." Fights with Wisdom replied with what might have been the ghost of a smile. The 2 warriors returned, carrying items. They set them down near Jeb's fire, a wrapped bundle that smelled like smoked meat, a leather pouch that clinked softly, and something wrapped in decorated hide. "You shared when you had little. Now we share because we choose to," Fights with Wisdom said. "The meat is buffalo, hunted before the sickness came. It will last many days. The pouch contains herbs that help with prairie wounds. And this," he picked up the hide-wrapped object and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a beautifully crafted knife with an antler handle, decorated with intricate beadwork. "This was made by my daughter's husband. He was skilled with his hands. She wanted to burn it with his other possessions, as is our way, but I stopped her. Now I understand why. It was meant to come to you." Jeb felt his throat tighten. "I can't accept." "You can, and you will," Fights with Wisdom interrupted gently. "My daughter has eaten for the first time since Dakota's death. She spoke his name, releasing him to the spirit world. Your kindness broke through her grief when her own family could not. This is no small thing." The warrior with the scar said something sharp in their language. Fights with Wisdom responded curtly, then turned back to Jeb. "Red Hawk reminds me that not all our people trust whites, with good reason. But I have lived long enough to know that a man's heart is shown by his actions. When he thinks no one is watching, tonight, you have shown yours." They began to fade back into the darkness, as suddenly as they'd appeared. But Fights with Wisdom paused at the edge of the firelight. "Tomorrow, you will reach a place where 3 creeks meet. Turn south there. The hunting is better, and you will avoid the cavalry patrols that ride the northern trail. They are unkind to solitary travelers of any color." Then they were gone, leaving Jeb alone with his dying fire and the gifts they'd brought. He sat there for a long time, processing what had just happened. In all his years of wandering, he'd never experienced anything like it. He picked up the knife, admiring the craftsmanship. Dakota had indeed been skilled. The balance was perfect, the blade sharp and well-forged. The beadwork on the handle told a story Jeb couldn't read, but could appreciate. Belle snorted softly, as if commenting on the night's events. Jeb stood and walked over to her, running his hand along her neck. "Strange night, girl," he murmured. Strange night indeed. He returned to his bedroll, but didn't lie down yet. Instead, he built the fire back up and unwrapped some of the buffalo meat. It was perfectly smoked, and his mouth watered at the smell. He cut off a piece with Dakota's knife, noting how cleanly it sliced, and ate slowly, savoring it. As he ate, he thought about Morning Dove's grief-stricken face, about Fights with Wisdom's dignity, about the way simple human kindness could bridge worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. He thought about his own loss as the wife who'd died in childbirth, taking their baby with her, the way he'd fled civilization afterward, unable to bear the sympathy and the memories. Maybe that's why he'd recognized the depth of Mourning Dove's pain. He'd worn that same hollow look, had wandered just as lost, though his wilderness had been internal as much as external. The prairie wind picked up, rustling the cottonwood leaves. Somewhere far off, a night bird called. Jeb finally lay down, the knife within easy reach, the meat rewrapped and stored in his saddlebags. For the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so alone. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a grieving woman had taken the first step back toward life. A father had chosen trust over suspicion, and a lonely cowboy had been reminded that even in the vast emptiness of the Dakota territory, human connections could spark from the simplest gestures. As sleep finally began to claim him, Jeb made a decision. Tomorrow, he would turn south at the Three Creeks, following Fights with Wisdom's advice. But he would also keep his eyes open for signs of the tribe's camp, not to intrude, but to be available if Mourning Dove or her people needed anything a wandering cowboy could provide. The fire burned low again, but the warmth of the evening's events remained. In sharing half a piece of cornbread, Jebediah Cole had received far more than food and gifts. He'd received a reminder of why human kindness mattered. Even especially in the hardest of times, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs. But beneath them, a lonely cowboy slept a little easier, and somewhere in the prairie darkness, a grieving woman had remembered what it felt like to be seen and cared for by another human being. Dawn came slowly to the prairie, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jeb woke to the sound of Belle nickering softly, her way of telling him it was time to move. His body protested as he sat up. Sleeping on the ground was a young man's game, and he wasn't young anymore, but the smell of the buffalo meat in his saddlebags reminded him of the previous night's extraordinary events. As he broke camp, every item the tribe had given him seemed to carry weight beyond its physical presence. The knife slid perfectly into his belt, the herbs went into his saddlebags next to his meager medical supplies, and the buffalo meat, well, that would change his eating habits for the next week at least. By mid-morning, he reached the place Fights with Wisdom had described. Three creeks indeed met here, creating a small, fertile valley dotted with more cottonwoods and thick grass. Jeb paused Belle at the convergence, looking north along the trail he would have taken, then south toward the unknown path recommended by the old warrior. "What do you think, girl?" he asked Belle. "Trust the advice of strangers." Belle tossed her head and began walking south without prompting, as if the decision had already been made. Jeb smiled despite himself. Sometimes the horse had more sense than the rider. The southern trail was less worn but more beautiful. The grass grew thicker here, and he spotted deer tracks, rabbit droppings, and other signs of abundant game. Fights with Wisdom had been right about the hunting opportunities, but it was what Jeb saw 3 hours later that made him pull Belle to a sudden stop. Smoke. Not the black smoke of destruction, but the gray-white wisps of cooking fires, multiple fires. A camp. His first instinct was to circle wide, avoid contact, but something made him hesitate. The smoke was rising from a sheltered valley ahead, and even from this distance, he could see it wasn't a military camp or a settler's homestead. The pattern was wrong for either. He dismounted and ground-tied Belle, then climbed a small rise on foot for a better view. What he saw below made him freeze. It was a native camp, but something was terribly wrong. He could see perhaps 20 lodges, but only a handful had smoke rising from them. People moved between the structures, but slowly, like they were carrying heavy burdens. Even from this distance, he could feel the weight of sorrow hanging over the camp like a shroud. The smallpox. This had to be Mourning Dove's band, devastated by the disease. As he watched, he saw a figure he recognized. Fights with Wisdom, directing to younger men who were carrying something wrapped in blankets. A body, Jeb realized with a chill. They were still losing people. He should leave. This wasn't his tragedy, wasn't his place. But as he turned to go, he saw her, Mourning Dove, standing outside one of the lodges, her arms wrapped around herself. She was looking up at the sky, and even from this distance, He could see the dejection in her posture. Before he could think better of it, Jeb was walking back to Belle and mounting up. But instead of riding away, he guided her down the slope toward the camp. It was foolish, probably dangerous, definitely not his business. But he kept thinking about that shared piece of cornbread and the gifts in his saddlebags. The first person to spot him was Red Hawk, the scarred warrior from the night before. He called out a warning, and suddenly Jeb found himself the focus of many eyes. Women pulled children behind them. Men reached for weapons. But Fights with Wisdom emerged from a lodge and raised his hand. Calling out something in his language, the tension eased fractionally. Though Jeb could still feel the weight of suspicious gazes, "You were told to go south," Fights with Wisdom said as Jeb dismounted at the edge of the camp. "Not to come here. I did go south," Jeb replied. The smoke was visible from the trail. I wanted to check if you needed anything." "Need?" Red Hawk had approached, his English heavily accented but clear. "We need our dead to live again. We need the spotted sickness to leave. Can you give us these things, white man?" Red Hawk, Fights with Wisdom said warningly. "No, he's right," Jeb said. "I can't bring back the dead. But I've got some medical supplies, and I've seen smallpox before. Sometimes there are things that help. White man's medicine brought this curse." Another warrior spat. Jeb nodded slowly. "You're right. White men's diseases have killed more of your people than bullets ever did. I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise. But I've got some willow bark for fever, and I know how to make people comfortable when they're sick. It's not much, but it's what I can offer." Fights with Wisdom studied him for a long moment. Behind him, Mourning Dove had emerged from the lodge and was watching the exchange. Her face was still drawn with grief, but there was something else there now, a flicker of curiosity. "Perhaps." "Show me these supplies," Fights with Wisdom said finally. Jeb returned to Belle and pulled out his medical kit. It wasn't much willow bark as he'd said. Some laudanum he'd bought in the last town, clean bandages, and a few other basic items. But he also had something else. Something he'd learned from an army doctor years ago. The sickness spreads by touch, he said, demonstrating by not directly handling the items. The people who care for the sick need to wash with hot water and lie soap between patients. Burn the bedding and clothes of those who die. Keep the sick separated from the healthy. We know to burn the possessions of the dead, Red Hawk said stiffly. But do you burn them immediately? And do the caretakers wash between patients? Jeb pressed gently. I'm not trying to tell you your business, but I've seen this work in other places. Fights with Wisdom translated for some of the others who had gathered. An elderly woman spoke up sharply, gesturing at Jeb. The discussion that followed was heated, but Jeb caught Mourning Dove's eye during the debate. She gave him the slightest nod, as if to say she understood he was trying to help. Finally, Fights with Wisdom turned back to him. White Elk Woman, our healer, says she will try your suggestions, but you must understand if more die, some will blame you. I understand, Jeb said. I'm not asking to stay, just wanted to share what I know. You would leave? Mourning Dove spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse but clear. After riding into danger to help, the question hung in the air. Jeb met her dark eyes, seeing in them not just grief but a kind of desperate hope. I'll stay if I'm wanted, he said simply. Leave if I'm not. Fights with Wisdom looked between his daughter and the white man who'd fed her in her darkest hour. Something passed over his weathered face. Decision, resignation, perhaps hope. You will stay, he said, but you will camp outside our circle, there by the eastern creek. You will not enter lodges, without invitation, and if the sickness takes you, you care for yourself. Fair enough, Jeb agreed, as he led Belle to the indicated spot. He heard Red Hawk arguing again with Fights with Wisdom, but he also heard Mourning Dove's voice, quiet but firm, apparently defending his presence. It was the most engaged she'd sounded since he'd first seen her, setting up his camp within sight, but apart from the main band. Jeb wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He had no illusions about his medical knowledge. It was basic at best, but sometimes, in the face of tragedy, just having someone willing to help was medicine of its own kind. As the sun reached its peak, White Elk Woman approached with two younger women. Through gestures and broken English, She indicated she wanted to see his washing technique. Jeb demonstrated with water from the creek, showing how to scrub thoroughly, especially under the nails and between the fingers. The old woman watched critically, then nodded and said something to her companions. They hurried off, and soon Jeb could see them organizing others, setting up washing stations between the lodges. It was a small thing. It might not make any difference at all. But as Jeb watched the camp mobilize with new purpose, he felt something shift. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. That evening, as he sat by his solitary fire eating buffalo meat, Morning Dove approached. She stood at the edge of his camp, respecting the boundaries her father had set. "You came back," she said simply. "Seemed like you folks could use a hand," Jeb replied. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Dakota would have liked you. He always said kindness was the mark of true strength. Sounds like he was a wise man." "He was." Her voice caught, but she continued. "Thank you. For last night. For today. For." She gestured helplessly, unable to find the words. "No thanks needed," Jeb said. "We all need help sometimes. Today it's you. Tomorrow it might be me." She nodded and turned to go, then paused. "The knife. You carry it." Jeb touched the handle at his belt. "I do. It's finely made. Use it well," she said softly. Dakota believed tools should fulfill their purpose, not sit idle. Then she was gone, walking back to her lodge with a bit more steadiness than she'd shown that morning. Jeb watched her go, then turned his attention back to his fire. He'd started this journey running from his own grief, seeking solitude in the vast prairie. But sometimes it seemed the universe had other plans. Sometimes a shared piece of cornbread could lead to unexpected connections, and sometimes those connections could grow into something larger than any individual sorrow. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jeb settled in for his first night as an unlikely helper to a grieving band. He didn't know if his presence would make any real difference, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was where he needed to be. The circle of healing to weeks passed in a blur of activity and cautious hope. The death toll from the smallpox had slowed, though whether due to Jeb's hygiene measures or simply the natural course of the disease, no one could say for certain. What was undeniable was the change in the camp's atmosphere. Where there had been only despair, now there was movement, purpose, and the faintest glimmer of recovery. Jeb had maintained his separate camp by the eastern creek, but his days were spent working alongside the band. He helped construct isolation shelters for the sick, taught the young men to hunt in ways that avoided the cavalry patrols he'd learned to track, and spent evenings sharing what knowledge he had about treating wounds and preventing infection. White Elk Woman had become an unlikely ally. Despite the language barrier, they developed a system of communication through gestures and demonstrations. She taught him about prairie medicines. He'd never known which roots reduced fever, which bark helped with pain, while he showed her how to distill alcohol from fermented mash for cleaning wounds. But it was his growing friendship with Morning Dove that marked the real change. She'd begun joining him for evening meals, always maintaining proper distance, but gradually sharing more of her story. Dakota had been a dreamer, she told him, an artist who saw beauty everywhere. Their son, Little Fox, had inherited his father's quick laugh and gentle nature. He would have been 6 winters old next moon, she said one evening, poking at Jeb's fire with a stick. Just old enough to begin learning the bow. "Tell me about him," Jeb said softly, and she did. For the first time since their deaths, she spoke freely about her lost family. The words came haltingly at first, then in a flood funny stories about Little Fox's attempts to ride the gentlest ponies, tender memories of Dakota's courtship, dreams they'd shared for their future. Jeb listened without interrupting, recognizing the healing power of being heard. When she finally fell silent, tears streaming down her face, he shared his own story. Her name was Mary, he said, staring into the fire. Hair like sunset, laugh like spring rain. We'd only been married 2 years. When she got pregnant, I'd never been happier. Morning Dove waited, understanding that this was a gift, the sharing of pain that he'd kept locked away for so long. The birth went wrong. Doctor said the baby was turned wrong, that there was nothing anyone could have done. I lost them both in one night. After that, I couldn't stay in that town, that house. Every corner held a memory. So I started writing and just never stopped. They sat in companionable silence, to people who understood that some losses never fully healed, but that carrying them alone made them heavier. You're Mary, Mourning Dove said eventually. She would not want you to ride alone forever. Dakota wouldn't want you to stop living either. Jeb replied gently. She smiled a real smile, the first he'd seen from her. Perhaps our dead are wiser than we are. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 cavalry soldiers appeared on the ridge above the camp. Their blue uniforms stark against the prairie grass. The camp erupted in controlled panic weapons. Appeared, children were hustled into lodges, and the warriors formed a defensive line. Jeb quickly mounted Bell and rode out to intercept them, his heart pounding. He knew how these encounters could go, had seen the aftermath of cavalry visits to native camps. Morning, soldiers, he called out as he approached, keeping his hands visible. Something I can help you with. The sergeant, a grizzled man with sun-damaged skin, looked him up and down with obvious suspicion. And who might you be? Jeb Cole, independent trader. Jeb lied smoothly. Been doing some business with this band. Trading what, exactly? The sergeant's eyes narrowed. Horses, mainly. Some pelts, nothing the army would be interested in. These Indians been giving you any trouble? No trouble at all. Peaceful folks, just trying to survive like everyone else. The sergeant spat tobacco juice to the side. Heard there was smallpox in some of the bands around here. Jeb's mind raced. If the soldiers thought the camp was infected, they might decide to contain the situation with bullets and fire. There was some sickness a few weeks back, he said carefully. But it's past now. I've been here 2 weeks myself, healthy as a horse. The sergeant studied him, then looked past him at the camp. Jeb could see him counting lodges, assessing strength. You know, these Indians are supposed to be on the reservation, the sergeant said. Didn't know that. Jeb lied again. They told me they were heading that way after the hunting season. See that they do. We'll be back through here in a month. I better not find them still camped here. I'll pass along the message. The sergeant gave him one last suspicious look, then wheeled his horse around. You be careful, Cole. Man can lose himself out here. Forget which side he's on. I'll keep that in mind, Jeb replied evenly. He waited until the soldiers were well out of sight before riding back to the camp. Fights with Wisdom met him at the edge, his face grave. We heard, a month. Jeb nodded. I'm sorry. I tried to buy you more time. You bought us any time at all. For that, we are grateful. The old warrior paused, then added, you could have ridden with them. Told them about the sickness, about our weakness. Why didn't you? Jeb thought about it, then shrugged. Guess I figured out which side I'm on. That evening, the camp held a council. Jeb wasn't invited, but he could see the animated discussions from his place by the creek. Mourning Dove came to him as the moon rose. We will leave in 1 week, she said. Some will go to the reservation. Others, she trailed off. Others will keep running. Jeb finished. Can't say I blame them. My father wants to speak with you. Jeb followed her to Fights with Wisdom's lodge. Inside, the old warrior sat with several other elders, including White Elk Woman. The air was thick with pipe smoke and gravity. Jeb Cole, Fights with Wisdom began formally. You came to us as a stranger who shared bread with my grieving daughter. You stayed as a friend who shared our danger and our sorrow. Now we must part, but not as strangers. White Elk Woman spoke in their language, and Fights with Wisdom translated. She says you have the healing spirit, that you should not waste it wandering alone. One of the other elders, a man Jeb hadn't interacted with much, pulled out a beautifully beaded band and handed it to Fights with Wisdom. This is an honor band, the old warrior explained. It marks you as a friend to our people. Any of our bands who see it will know you are under our protection. Jeb accepted it reverently, understanding the weight of the gift. I don't know what to say. Say you will remember us, Mourning Dove said softly. Say you will not go back to riding alone. I remember, Jeb promised. All of it. The next week passed too quickly. Jeb helped the band prepare for their journey, repairing wagons, hunting for travel provisions, teaching the young men trails that would avoid military patrols. On the last night, The entire band gathered for a farewell feast. There was still sadness. Too many faces were missing. Too many stories ended too soon. But there was also resilience, hope, and a determination to survive. Jeb found himself pulled into the dancing, awkward but welcomed, as the drums beat out rhythms older than memory. As dawn approached on the day of departure, Morning Dove came to his camp one last time. She carried a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "This was Little Fox's," she said, handing it to him. "A toy horse Dakota carved for him. I want you to have it." "I can't take this," Jeb protested. "It's too precious." "That's why you must take it," she insisted. "To remember that even in loss, there is still love. That even in solitude, we are connected." She placed her hand briefly on his chest, over his heart. "You carry your Mary here. I carry Dakota and Little Fox. But we also carry each other now, all of us who shared these weeks. That is how we go on." The band departed as the sun climbed higher, a long line of people and horses and travois heading toward an uncertain future. Jeb watched from his camp until they disappeared over a rise, then sat by his cold fire for a long time, holding the carved horse. Finally, he stood and began breaking camp. But for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't just wandering. He had a direction now, back towards civilization, toward places where his medical knowledge might help others. The prairie had taught him many things, but Morning Dove and her people had taught him the most important lesson: healing others could. Begin to heal yourself. As he mounted Belle and turned her eastward, Jeb touched the honor band now wrapped around his arm. He was still alone, technically, but he no longer felt lonely. Somewhere out there, a native band carried the memory of a cowboy who'd shared his bread. And here, a cowboy carried the memory of people who'd shared their hearts. The circle was complete. The healing could continue. Belle stepped forward eagerly, as if she just sensed the change. Behind them, the abandoned camp showed few signs of the profound connections that had been forged there. But the prairie remembered, as prairies always do, in the whisper of grass and the turning of seasons. And in the heart of a no longer lonely cowboy, the fire of human kindness burned brighter than ever, ready to warm whoever might need it on the long trail ahead.